Wednesday's op-ed published in the New York Times, an anonymous senior White House official claims that many staffers were concerned about instability in the administration. In response to that alleged instability, some staffers apparently considered taking drastic measures. The anonymous official writes, quote, "Given the instability many witnessed, there were early whispers within the cabinet of invoking the 25th Amendment, which would start a complex process for removing the president. But no one wanted to precipitate a constitutional crisis. The process for removing a president from office is laid out in Section 4 of the 25th Amendment. While that process has never been invoked, other sections of the 25th Amendment have played a role in previous administrations." Joining me now from Haymarket, Virginia, is presidential historian Doug Wead. He was also a special assistant to President George H.W. Bush. Doug, thanks for joining us. In your career, have you ever seen anything like this New York Times op-ed?
Yes, I have, but with a caveat, this is a little bit different. All through history, there are these types of complaints from the administration. For example, I served George Herbert Walker Bush, and I can pull a book off the shelf here by Barbara that talks about someone who went on television, whose voice was distorted and whose face was blacked out to complain about things. And so it does happen. Abraham Lincoln had one of his own cabinet members constantly refer to him in his letters to his wife as "our dear imbecile." They thought Lincoln was just absolutely crazy, many of them. So yes, it happens. The difference is the relationship with the media today. Normally, the media is often complicit with the White House. So they'd get someone would approach them like this. The New York Times would go back to the White House and say, "Hey, you got somebody who's off the range there." And that's because the New York Times and the media normally need the White House. I remember when I worked in the White House, David Hoffman, great writer for the Washington Post, he leaked the upcoming summit was going to be held in Cyprus. And the president said, anyone who's even seen in the presence of David Hoffman will be fired. Well, that ended his assignment at the White House. They moved him to the Pentagon, and you couldn't have a career unless the White House gave you access. But obviously, the New York Times isn't worried about losing access.
Well, and they would argue, and they have said, that in fact this is a separate op-ed division that looked at this, and so it's a separation, they contend, between those folks who do cover the White House on a daily basis and those op-ed editors. So let me ask you, though, the author of this op-ed contemplates using the 25th Amendment to remove the president from office. Is the amendment clear on what qualifies as an inability to serve?
Yeah, not technically. It's the will of the vice president. It's a number of the cabinet officers that have to be involved. Eventually, it's 2/3 of the Senate and the House. In short, it ain't going to happen. Impeachment is c'est du gâteau compared to this. It would be much easier to impeach him. Now, the Article 3 of the 25th Amendment was invoked when I was in the White House, and it was because President Reagan underwent an anesthetic and lost consciousness, and they had to have someone ready to go. But even then, when the cabinet met, the vice president, George Herbert Walker Bush, refused to sit in Ronald Reagan's chair. He kept it empty, sending the message that, no, I'm not going to step in, don't worry. So Article 4 is a little complex, and that reveals a little bit about this anonymous writer. Both the lodestar ploy and this invoking of Article 4 tells me this is not quite a very sophisticated operator, that the lodestar thing is pretty clumsy, and invoking Section 4 of Article 25. I guarantee you there have not been open discussions among cabinet officers about this.
Because what would they have to weigh before proceeding, if in fact this was discussed?
Well, they'd have to weigh the end of their involvement in the Trump White House. Elaine, there's politics at the corporation, and then there's politics in politics. It is a snake pit. The White House is a snake pit. Any one of those cabinet officers showing the slightest disrespect or disloyalty would be used by the others to get them all to agree on the same day for the same thing as this anonymous writer is suggesting here is a bit far-fetched.
Well, I want to ask you about the leaks out of the White House. Leon Panetta, who served as chief of staff for President Bill Clinton, has said, quote, greater loyalty to the president is the best approach to plugging leaks. Do you agree with his assessment?
I do. But again, the point I was making earlier, Elaine, is the White House doesn't have the normal leverage that a White House has had in the past. The White House is open warfare against the media. The media is the enemy. So it's hard for them to come back. I look at George Will, for example. He's a great writer, wonderful writer. The Reagans loved him. Nancy Reagan, the favorite. But his career was set back enormously because he wrote an article that offended the Bushes, and there were 4 years of Herbert Walker and then 8 years of George W., and Newsweek was shut out. It was a great price to pay. So with that kind of leverage, these news organizations in the past had to be more careful about entertaining insurrection or complaints or accusations in the White House. Now, I think the gloves are off, and they would welcome these sort of op-eds over the transom.
Yeah, I know it's cliche, and everyone has said it, but we really do feel like we are in uncharted territory now. Doug Wead, thank you so much, Doug.
We are. Thank you, Elaine.